Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before the Marine in room 347 coded. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Margaret Walsh folded her discount scrubs with the precision of someone who had once folded parachutes for a living. The staff locker room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, the same smell that had clung to every military hospital she'd ever worked in, though those were places she could never mention. Her fingers traced the long pale scars running down her forearms, thin lines like latitude markings on a map of every place she'd been that nobody was supposed to know about. She pulled her sleeves down. The scars disappeared. Nobody at Seattle General needed to see them. Third day on the unit. Her shift started at 6 in the evening and ended at 6 in the morning, which was exactly how she preferred it. Night shifts were quieter. Fewer administrators. Fewer eyes on the patient charts that didn't quite add up, the recurring surgical site infections that appeared in precisely the same pattern, the equipment orders that didn't match the inventory counts, the subtle erosion of safety margins that suggested something deeper than simple negligence. Margaret had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of being invisible, and invisibility meant access. Access meant watching. Watching meant knowing. She closed her locker and her hand lingered on the door for a moment. Inside, on the top shelf, sat a pair of infant-sized combat boots. The leather was cracked and faded to a color somewhere between sand and rust. They weighed almost nothing. She touched them once, just the sole of the left boot, her index finger pressing against worn tan leather, before turning the key in the lock. The nurse's station on the 4th floor cardiac unit hummed with evening activity. 2 nurses were updating charts. One was restocking the medication dispensary. A clerk was fielding calls at the main desk. And Dr. Caldwell was standing in the center of the room like a man who had never learned to occupy space quietly. He wore a watch that cost more than Margaret made in a month. Stainless steel and black face, the kind of timepiece that announced itself. His scrubs were pressed crisp enough to cut with designer surgical shirts, Margaret realized, which meant he never actually touched patients. His hair was salted just right, professionally maintained, the look of a man who visited a barber every 2 weeks. He was speaking to the other nurses, and his voice had the particular timbre of someone accustomed to being listened to. "New hire," he said, and Margaret heard the slight tilt toward condescension. "I'm calling it now. 1 week. That's all she lasts on this unit." One of the nurses, her name tag read Patricia, shifted uncomfortably. "It's only been 3 days, Dr. Caldwell." "Doesn't matter," he said. "I can always tell. The ones with the spine, they move up. The rest." He snapped his fingers. The sound was sharp. "Deliberate. Gone." Margaret sat down at the charting station and opened a patient file. Room for 12, post-op day 2, recovering from bypass grafting. She kept her eyes on the monitor in front of her. Her jaw tightened, not visibly, just a single muscle contracting in her left temple, barely perceptible unless someone was specifically looking for it. No one was looking. That was the point. That was always the point. She finished charting and stood to make her first rounds. The unit was laid out in a careful circuit, 3 hallways, 32 rooms, each one containing someone whose heart was failing or had failed or was threatening to fail in the next 72 hours. She moved through the hallways with the economical gait of someone accustomed to covering distance without announcing her presence. Room for 01. Vital stable, 02 sat 96%. Room for 03. Pain management adequate, patient resting. Room for 05. Postoperative day 1, minor swelling around the incision site. She kept moving. The cafeteria was on the 2nd floor, and she went down at 7:15 for the only meal she would eat during her shift. The fluorescent lights there were somehow worse than on the unit, brighter, harsher, casting everything in a sickly pale yellow. She collected a tray from the line, a turkey sandwich, a container of low-fat yogurt, a bottle of water, an apple. She moved to an empty table near the back, where she could sit with her back against the wall. Old habits. Dr. Caldwell entered the cafeteria approximately 4 minutes after she sat down. He was with another doctor, an older man Margaret recognized from the surgical floor, and they were laughing about something, the kind of laughter that emerged from a shared understanding of superiority. They collected their food and moved through the cafeteria with the confidence of men who had never been told no. Caldwell passed her table twice, once on the way to get coffee, once on the way back. The third time, he stopped directly beside her chair. "Excuse me," he said. Margaret looked up. His expression was already constructed, a smile that wasn't a smile, the kind of look a man practiced in mirrors. She waited. "Are you using this seat?" he asked. And then, without waiting for an answer, he reached down and swept his arm across the edge of her tray. The motion was casual, almost conversational. Smooth. The tray tilted. The water bottle tipped first, then the yogurt container. The apple rolled. The sandwich slid across the plastic surface and tumbled over the edge, landing on the floor with a wet slapping sound. The bottle cracked against the tile and water began spreading across the floor in a thin sheet, reflecting the fluorescent lights like a mirror. "Clumsy," he said. His tone suggested this was a neutral observation. His eyes said something else entirely. Margaret didn't move. "It happens," he continued, and then he walked away, back to his colleague, back to his laughter, back to the invisible wall that separated people like him from people like her. Or people like who they thought she was. For 6 seconds, nobody else in the cafeteria spoke. The sound of the water dripping onto the tile was perfectly audible. Then the ambient noise resumed, conversations, the scrape of chairs, the mechanical hum of the kitchen vents. The moment had passed. Margaret stood. She gathered the remains of her meal, the soaked sandwich, the cracked yogurt container, the bruised apple, and carried them to the trash. One of the kitchen staff appeared with a mop without being asked. She had seen this before. Spills happened frequently. Caldwell had probably done this before. The staff was trained not to notice. She went to the linen closet on the second floor and retrieved paper towels. She returned to the table and wiped it clean herself. Her hands were absolutely steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her face, if anyone had been watching closely enough, would have shown nothing at all. But that wasn't the worst part. She returned to the unit at 7:59 and found Dr. Caldwell standing at the nurse's station, holding a patient chart. His posture had shifted. He was no longer relaxed. He held the chart the way a predator holds prey, with casual carelessness that conveyed complete ownership. "Walsh," he said. "Not Margaret. Not Ms. Walsh." The single name, thrown like a stone. She turned toward him. "Room for 12. This patient was supposed to receive a full cardiac panel this morning. Pre-op orders." He held the chart toward her. Not to hand it to her, to drop it. To let gravity do the work. The chart fell to the floor with a whisper of paper. "I'd hate for this to be another example of carelessness on your part." Margaret looked at the chart on the floor. She looked at his face. His eyes were bright with something that wasn't quite amusement but lived in the same neighborhood. Then she bent and picked it up. "I'll check on it immediately, doctor," she said. Her voice was quiet. Her voice was deferential. Her voice was the voice of someone who had learned to make herself small, to take up less space, to apologize for her own existence. "See that you do," he said. She turned and walked away, the chart in her hands. Her gait remained measured. Her shoulders remained straight. To anyone watching, she was simply a nurse completing her duties. To anyone watching very carefully, they might have noticed that her hands, once she was out of sight, had begun to shake. But not from fear. Not from anger either, though anger was certainly present, a low steady flame burning behind her ribs. The trembling was restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing, moment by moment, hour by hour, not to do it. She climbed the stairs to the 4th floor and moved through the hallways to the supply closet. The closet was small, barely larger than a coat rack, lined with shelves of gauze pads, saline solution, wound dressings, and the 1,000 small consumables that kept a hospital functioning. She stepped inside and closed the door. The light clicked on automatically. For 3 seconds, she did nothing. Then she pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving and allowed herself one shaking breath. Just one. Her eyes closed. Her shoulders tensed and then slowly, released. When she opened her eyes again, her face was composed. Her hands were steady. She stepped back out into the hallway and closed the supply closet door behind her. Room for 12 could wait 30 seconds. She had other patients to check on. She had a unit to monitor. She had an entire mission that depended on her maintaining her cover as something she wasn't. The infant-sized boots in her locker represented 20 years of patience. 20 years of waiting to know why a Marine named Derek Morrison lay somewhere in her hospital, why his chart showed patterns that matched no legitimate post-operative recovery, why his infection profile suggested something more deliberate than coincidence. She made her way to room 347 at 8:23. The room was dim, patient preference, documented in the chart. The monitors cast a pale blue glow across the walls. The ventilator breathed in quiet mechanical rhythm, the only sound besides the steady beeping of the heart monitor holding a metronome at 64 beats per minute. Captain Derek Morrison lay motionless on the hospital bed, his body wrapped in monitoring wires like some kind of technological chrysalis. He was post-operative day 3, recovering from an emergency splenectomy that had been performed after what the official record described as a climbing accident, though there were no climbing injuries documented in his admission notes. Margaret stopped in the doorway. The man in the bed bore almost no resemblance to the person she remembered. 20 years had changed him in the way that 2 decades changed everyone, the hair darker than she expected, the face leaner, bearing the physical weight of whatever had happened to him between now and the last time she had seen him conscious. But his hands, resting on top of the blanket, were the hands she remembered. Long fingers. Calloused palms. The kind of hands that had been designed to grip something and hold on. 20 years ago, those hands had belonged to an infant. She had held them against her chest while mortars fell like rain and shrapnel carved patterns through her skin. She had shielded a crying child with her own body while the world came apart around them. And then, after the evacuation, after the medical transports, after the chaos had passed into history, she had never seen him again. Until now. Until he lay here in room 347, his body failing in ways that suggested something more organized than accident. Her hand hovered over the door handle for exactly 3 seconds. She could walk in. She could check his chart. She could assess his vitals and confirm what she already suspected, that Derek Morrison was being quietly murdered in a hospital bed, one infection at a time, and nobody had noticed because nobody was looking. She didn't walk in. Not yet. She pulled her hand back and turned away from the room. She walked back down the hallway to room for 12 and opened the chart that Dr. Caldwell had thrown at her feet. The patient was indeed waiting for a cardiac panel. The order had never been placed. She would place it now. She would do her job exactly as it should be done, invisible and competent and utterly unremarkable. But her mind was already elsewhere. Already running through calculations. Already beginning to prepare for what happened next. Because something had changed in the moment she saw Derek Morrison's hands resting on that hospital blanket. 20 years of being patient had just become 20 years of running out of time. Caldwell's network activated at 3:17 a.m., while Margaret was still in the supply closet documenting the third batch of falsified shipping manifests. His first call went to Richard Hartwell, the board member who'd quietly pocketed $147,000 in fraudulent billing kickbacks over 18 months. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. "We have a situation," Caldwell said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "New night shift nurse. Margaret Walsh. She's asking questions about equipment orders. Reckless type. Inappropriate judgment." He paused, letting silence do the work. "I'm handling it, but I wanted you aware. In case she contacts the board with complaints. You know how these things go." Hartwell understood perfectly. He'd heard 3 variations of this same call before, each time followed by the problem disappearing. "I'll make some calls," Hartwell said. "Let me know if you need anything." Caldwell's second call went to Patricia Nguyen at 3:34 a.m. She'd received $203,000 in equipment supply contracts that had no legitimate basis in actual hospital needs. "Patricia, it's Caldwell. Seattle General. We need to move quickly on something." He described Margaret as a nurse with significant credibility gaps and a suspicious background that doesn't quite add up. He didn't accuse her of anything directly. He simply planted the seed, someone to watch, someone whose professional integrity might merit closer examination. Patricia worked in hospital administration across 3 states. She had Caldwell's interests protected through 7 different relationships. Within 2 hours, she'd made her own calls. The third board member, Victor Chen, received Caldwell's message at 4:11 a.m. This one was delivered differently, not a phone call but a text message carefully worded as concern rather than conspiracy, new staff member showing erratic behavior and judgment issues. Might be worth mentioning to legal. Better safe than liable. Victor was a lawyer. He understood the language of risk mitigation. He also understood that Caldwell never warned about staff unless elimination was already underway. Margaret didn't know about any of this yet. She was still in the basement laundry room, methodically folding her discharge scrubs, pressing creases with the same precision she'd given to every task in this 18-month mission. The industrial fluorescent lights hummed above her head like insects trapped in glass. The smell of bleach and hot cotton hung thick in the air. She'd spent 16 hours documenting the supply chain anomalies, cross-referencing shipping dates with patient infection charts, photographing documents with a phone that technically didn't exist in any government database. The pattern was airtight. Caldwell had been substituting certified surgical equipment with unmarked inventory from a distributor called Pacific Medical Solutions, a shell company registered to an address in Reno, Nevada that housed nothing but a mailbox. The markup was consistent. 40% overbilling. The infections were equally consistent. For dead Marines in 18 months. For families receiving folded flags instead of sons coming home. Then she'd seen Morrison's chart. Fever spiking. White blood cell count climbing. The telltale signature of post-operative infection, same bacterial profile as the others. His surgical wound from 48 hours prior was already showing inflammation. The timing was cruel, his body rejecting something that should have saved him, poisoned by the very system designed to keep him alive. She'd stood in the supply room for 3 full minutes, reading those vital signs, knowing that if the contamination wasn't identified and treated aggressively, Derek Morrison would become victim number 5. She folded the last scrub carefully and placed it in a cardboard box marked Employee Termination, Personal Effects. The box contained exactly 4 items, her scrubs, her badge, a small notebook of patient notes, and at the bottom, wrapped in a hospital hand towel, the pair of worn combat boots she'd pulled from the rubble of the Helmand Province Embassy compound 20 years ago. The leather was cracked. The laces were gone, replaced with paracord. The soles were worn smooth from 2 decades of walking through hospitals, crime scenes, disaster zones, and military compounds. Those boots had never made it into an official inventory. They existed in only one place, pressed against her ribs under her civilian clothes, carried out of Afghanistan by a 24-year-old petty officer whose body was already learning to compartmentalize pain. At 5:42 a.m., Caldwell walked into the hospital's Human Resources Department. He was carrying a leather folder containing 3 documented incidents, all of them real encounters he'd had with Margaret, all of them reframed through a lens of professional concern. The memo he'd prepared described her as showing signs of instability, asking inappropriate questions about operational procedures, and demonstrating judgment lapses that could compromise patient safety. He'd been careful. Nothing provable. Nothing obviously false. Just the careful architecture of a man who'd spent 15 years learning how to destroy someone's credibility without leaving fingerprints. HR Director Susan Matthews received him at her desk. She was holding her 3rd coffee of the night shift, and Caldwell knew she'd approve his proposed outside investigator without much resistance. He'd already leaked his concerns to Patricia Nguyen, who'd already called Victor Chen, who'd already spoken to Susan's supervisor. By the time Caldwell walked through that door, Margaret Walsh's employment had already been decided. The investigation was just paperwork. "I'm concerned about liability," Caldwell said, sliding the folder across her desk. "We need an independent medical review. Someone unbiased. I have a recommendation." He offered the name of an investigator he'd used before, a man named Dr. Harrington who'd successfully documented credibility issues with 2 other staff members in the past 3 years. Both had been terminated. Both had accepted settlement agreements that included non-disclosure clauses. Dr. Harrington understood the implicit contract, find the problems that already exist in the personnel file, and there would be ongoing work for future incidents. Susan Matthews didn't ask many questions. She'd been in hospital administration for 9 years, and she understood the calculus of risk. A nurse with concerns about supply chain integrity was a liability. A nurse willing to follow proper channels was manageable. A nurse willing to ask questions outside of proper channels was a problem. The fact that Caldwell was already framing her as unstable made the decision simple. "I'll have Dr. Harrington contact you," Caldwell said. "Within 48 hours, we should have clarity." He was gone by 6:03 a.m. Margaret's references received their calls at staggered intervals between 6:30 and 9:15 a.m. The first was Bethesda Medical Center, where her cover employment as a night shift nurse had been fabricated 3 years prior, complete with a dormant employee file and a supervisor listed as unavailable for comment due to retirement. The investigator's call was careful and procedurally sound. "I'm conducting a routine background verification on Margaret Walsh. Could you confirm her employment dates and performance record?" The contact at Bethesda, actually a Navy intelligence asset embedded in their HR department, provided the exact information they'd been instructed to give if this call ever came. Employment confirmed. Dates verified. Performance adequate. Nothing suspicious. Nothing stellar. The kind of reference that proved nothing but couldn't be contradicted. The second call went to a civilian medical center in San Diego, to another cover reference. Same questions. Same neutral response. Same procedural soundness. To anyone listening, the investigator was doing legitimate work. To anyone who knew how to listen, the questions carried a specific undertone. Inconsistencies were being looked for. Problems were expected to be found. By noon, Dr. Harrington had compiled his report. 47 pages documenting Margaret's unauthorized deviation from protocol during Morrison's cardiac event, cross-referenced against her vague employment history, her limited professional network, and her isolated approach to nursing practice. The language was clinical. The conclusion was predetermined. Margaret Walsh was a liability. The emergency thoracotomy she'd performed, the procedure that had brought a dying Marine's heart back to beating, was now reframed as a dangerous improvisation, lack of proper authorization, and reckless endangerment of a patient. The termination meeting happened at 1:56 p.m. in a conference room on the 3rd floor. Margaret sat across from Susan Matthews and 2 members of the hospital's legal team. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The language was professional. The outcome was certain. "We appreciate your service," Susan said, which was the polite way of saying nothing. "However, we've identified performance concerns that require us to end your employment effective immediately." The document was already prepared. The severance was already calculated. The non-disclosure agreement was already waiting. All Margaret had to do was sign, and 18 months of infiltration would be over. All the evidence she'd gathered would remain locked inside her head. All the contaminated equipment still flowing into Morrison's room would continue. All the answers to why 4 Marines had died would stay buried in Caldwell's ledger. She could have walked out. She could have called her handlers. She could have broken cover and triggered a federal investigation that would have unraveled everything in 72 hours. The Navy wouldn't have let Caldwell slide. The evidence she'd photographed was solid. One phone call and the entire supply chain would be seized, analyzed, weaponized against him. But that phone call would also end any chance of staying close to Morrison while his infection ran its course. Margaret signed the documents without reading them. She accepted the severance check. She promised not to discuss the circumstances of her termination with anyone outside the organization. She nodded when Susan offered platitudes about wishing you the best in future endeavors. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. She didn't blink. The only sign of anything beneath the surface was a single muscle in her jaw that tightened for half a second before returning to neutral. The basement laundry room was empty when she returned at 2:15 p.m. to collect her box of personal effects. The industrial machines rumbled and hissed around her like mechanical breathing. Her fingers moved with deliberate care, folding the box flaps, securing them with tape. 22 years of military training had taught her how to compartmentalize. 20 months of this mission had taught her how to survive humiliation without flinching. But nothing had prepared her for the specific cruelty of watching someone you'd once shielded with your own body get poisoned by the system that was supposed to save him while you were standing outside it, powerless. She pressed her forehead against the cardboard box for exactly 3 seconds. Her breathing remained controlled. Her hands remained steady. In a minute, she would walk out of Seattle General Hospital as if she were just another tired nurse, terminated for performance issues, forgotten by everyone who mattered. In 3 minutes, she would be in her car. In 6 minutes, she would make a phone call to a number that didn't appear in any phone records. In 12 minutes, things would start moving in ways that Dr. Caldwell couldn't possibly predict. But first, she allowed herself to feel the weight of failure, not because she'd broken cover, but because breaking cover meant leaving Morrison to survive or die without her watching. It meant 18 months of careful work ending with her outside the walls instead of inside them. It meant the contaminated equipment would keep flowing until someone else found the pattern. And there was no one else looking. The fluorescent lights continued their insect-like humming. The smell of bleach grew thicker. Margaret Walsh, Master Chief Petty Officer, walked out of the basement carrying a cardboard box that contained everything officially documented about her existence at Seattle General Hospital. Everything that mattered, the photographs, the shipping manifests, the evidence, existed only in the small phone hidden in her glove compartment and the perfect memory of a woman trained to remember everything. She didn't know that Caldwell had just made a critical mistake. In his rush to eliminate her as a threat, he'd overplayed his hand. The calls to board members had left traces. The leading questions to her references had created a documentation trail. The outside investigator had been too thorough in documenting his predetermined conclusion, which meant the investigation itself was now visible to anyone who knew how to look for it. She didn't know that the moment she signed those termination papers, a federal flag had been triggered in 3 separate databases because Margaret Walsh's cover identity actually belonged to someone. Someone who mattered. Someone whose disappearance would get noticed by people with authority. But she would know in exactly 43 minutes, when her personal cell phone would ring with a number she recognized. And then everything would change. The fluorescent lights of Seattle General's 3rd-floor ICU cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made 2:17 a.m. feel like it existed outside of time. Margaret Walsh stood at the nursing station, Derek Morrison's chart open before her, her eyes tracking the progression of numbers that told a story Caldwell refused to read. Temperature at admission, 98.6. Temperature at 6 hours post-op, 99.2. Temperature now, 14 hours after the surgical implantation of a titanium hip joint, 103.1 degrees Fahrenheit. The fever had climbed like a ladder. The blood pressure had descended like a stone. She pulled up the wound photography from the surgical team, digital images taken every 4 hours as protocol demanded. The incision site at post-op hour 0 showed the expected surgical inflammation, red, slightly swollen, clean. By hour 6, the redness had deepened. By hour 10, a subtle cloudiness appeared beneath the skin, the kind of cloudiness that didn't belong. At hour 14, the tissue surrounding the incision had taken on the texture of waterlogged leather, and a thin amber fluid wept from the lowest point of the wound. Margaret had seen this progression exactly 17 times in her career. 16 of those patients had developed septic shock within 36 hours. All 16 had survived only because aggressive broad-spectrum antibiotics had been initiated within 22 hours of symptom onset. The 17th patient had not received those antibiotics. That patient had been a 23-year-old Army corporal from Fort Lewis. His name had been Michael Chen. His lungs had filled with fluid that his own immune system produced in a desperate attempt to drown the infection. He had drowned anyway. Margaret printed the wound photos, grabbed the lab results, WBC at 14,200 and climbing, CRP elevated at 8.7 mg per deciliter, lactate at 2.1, all of them screaming the same message, and walked to the on-call physician's sleep room on the second floor. Caldwell lay on the cot with his silk tie still knotted, his shoes still on, his phone dark on the nightstand. She knocked once. His eyes opened with the irritation of a man accustomed to being interrupted but not accustomed to waiting for permission. "Derek Morrison." "Room 347, Margaret said. 10 words. 10 words to explain what the numbers already knew. Caldwell rose with the speed of a man whose alarm had been triggered, grabbed the papers from her hands, and reviewed them for exactly 30 seconds. His jaw moved as he read, the muscles beneath his skin working with visible frustration. He handed the papers back. "He's fine. Post-operative fever is normal. The body responds to surgical trauma with inflammation. This is textbook. You're panicking over standard recovery." He was already moving back to the cot before she finished laying out the photos. "Stop wasting my time, Walsh." She waited. She had learned in Helm and Province that sometimes waiting was a weapon more effective than any tool in a medical kit. Waiting meant she was still standing when Caldwell turned back, irritated by her stillness. "What?" His voice had the sharp edge of a man who recognized defiance even when it wore the shape of silence. The wound progression. Hour 0 to hour 14. The fluid composition. The fever trajectory. Margaret extended the photos again, careful not to let her wrist move with any speed that might seem aggressive. "This is not standard post-operative inflammation." Caldwell glanced at the images. His face didn't change. Inflammatory response to a foreign body implant. Completely normal. The cytokine cascade activates and he stopped, as if explaining basic immunology to someone outside his hierarchy suddenly felt like a waste of energy. "I said he's fine. You're not a doctor. Stay in your lane." He left the room. The door closed with the soft hiss of air being forced through hydraulic hinges. Margaret stood alone in the silence, the wound photos still in her hands, and understood with absolute clarity what was happening. This wasn't incompetence. Caldwell had medical training sufficient to recognize the signs of early sepsis. What he had demonstrated was something far more dangerous, the deliberate choice not to see what he didn't want to acknowledge. A patient with serious post-operative infection meant complications, meant potential litigation, meant questions about the surgical supplies and the equipment procurement that had led to the infection in the first place. A patient who recovered uneventfully meant no scrutiny, meant the supply chain scheme could continue unmolested, meant the contaminated implants could keep flowing to Marines who had no idea they were being poisoned. Margaret returned to room 347 every 20 minutes for the next hour and 40 minutes. At 2:37 a.m., Derek Morrison's temperature had climbed to 103.4. His blood pressure had dropped to 94/58. His breathing had become shallower, that particular quality of respiration that happened when a body was beginning to fail its own basic functions. At 2:57 a.m., he was unresponsive to her voice. At 3:17 a.m., he was unresponsive to physical stimulation. She checked his pupils. They reacted to light, but slowly, as if consciousness itself was being filtered through an increasingly thick fog. By 4:56 a.m., he was barely breathing. The ventilator that was supposed to assist his recovery was working at maximum settings, and he was still fighting to pull air into his lungs, his chest rising and falling with the desperate effort of a man drowning while still in a hospital bed. Margaret paged Caldwell again. The page went unanswered for 8 minutes. Then 12. Then 16. She found him in his office on the 3rd floor, the door half closed, his desk lit by the glow of a computer monitor. He was reviewing something on his screen, something that made his fingers move across a mouse with the careful precision of someone documenting facts he wanted to be permanent. She recognized the interface. Financial software. Account tracking. He was reviewing statements, watching numbers accumulate in ways that had nothing to do with patient care. "Captain Morrison's deteriorating," Margaret said. Her voice had dropped a full octave. The deferential nurse persona was beginning to fracture, and she hadn't yet decided if she should try to glue it back together. "He needs immediate intervention. Septic shock protocol. Broad-spectrum antibiotic starting now. Possible return to OR for wound exploration." Caldwell didn't look away from the screen. "Write it in the chart. I'll check on him during morning rounds." "He doesn't have until morning rounds." Now Caldwell turned. He was 47 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, possessed of the kind of physical presence that came from expensive gym memberships and the confidence of a man who had never experienced real consequences for his actions. He stood, and in standing, he moved close enough that Margaret could smell the cologne he'd applied the previous evening, a sharp chemical scent like burning plastic. He stepped until he was in her personal space, not quite threatening, but close enough that the message was clear: she was a smaller person in a room where physical proximity was being weaponized. "You've been here 5 days. 5 days, and you think you can question my medical judgment? You think you can come into my office at 4 in the morning and tell me how to practice medicine?" His voice remained calm, which made it more dangerous than shouting would have been. "I can have you removed from this unit with 1 phone call. I can call your staffing agency and have your name flagged as a liability. I can contact every hospital in this state and ensure that no one hires you again. Do you understand the power dynamic we're operating in?" Margaret held his gaze. 3 seconds. Her eyes didn't blink. Her breathing didn't accelerate. Caldwell was looking at a woman who appeared to be composed, who appeared to be frightened, who appeared to be exactly what he thought she was, a temporary nurse, out of her depth, desperate to keep her job. What he was actually looking at was a woman who had spent 14 minutes in a Taliban detention facility, who had faced actual torture, who had been broken down and rebuilt so thoroughly that a man in a designer suit lecturing her about power dynamics felt like a conversation with a child playing at threat-making. "I understand," she said. Her voice was steady as a surgeon's hand. "I'll document my concerns in the chart. You do what you see fit." She turned and walked back to room 347. Behind her, she heard Caldwell return to his desk, heard the door close, heard the soft click of the mouse resuming its work. She had 1 hour before Caldwell's shift ended and the morning attending physician arrived. 1 hour to watch Derek Morrison continue spiraling into the septic shock that the contaminated equipment had initiated and that Caldwell's negligence would complete. 1 hour to witness the exact consequence she had come to this hospital to prevent: another Marine destroyed by the supply chain scheme she had been infiltrating for nearly 20 months. At 4:13 a.m., Margaret sat beside Morrison's bed and reviewed the timeline one final time. 20 years ago, she had thrown her body between a mortar round and the infant soldier who now lay dying in front of her. The shrapnel had torn into her back, had torn into the muscles and nerves and skin that would never fully heal. She had done it without hesitation, without calculation, because that was what soldiers did for their brothers and sisters. That was what the code demanded. And now, 20 years later, that same Marine was being systematically poisoned by equipment that should have been flagged weeks ago, by a physician who had chosen profit over duty, by a system that had decided that contaminated surgical hardware was an acceptable cost of doing business. The monitors beeped with their steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed. The 4-pump clicked as it infused fluids that Caldwell had refused to supplement with antibiotics. The fluorescent light above the bed hummed at exactly 60 Hz, the frequency of American electrical current, the frequency of a system that was designed to function smoothly as long as no one looked too closely at what was happening inside it. Margaret pressed her hand against Morrison's shoulder, the only part of his body that didn't have tubes or monitors attached, and made a decision that would burn 2 decades of careful operational cover to ash. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that somewhere in the hospital, in Caldwell's office, in his financial accounts, in the pharmaceutical supply chain that fed Seattle General's inventory, there were 17 other Marines with contaminated implants in their bodies. There were 42 more surgeries scheduled for next week. There were hundreds of Marines across Washington state who had no idea they were walking around with time bombs embedded in their bodies. And if Margaret walked away from Derek Morrison's bedside, if she allowed the protocol to complete its usual course, if she let this moment pass, those Marines would never know her name. They would never know that someone had tried to stop it. They would just die, quietly, in ways that could be documented as post-operative complications or chronic infection or the unpredictable chaos of modern medicine. At 5:38 a.m., Morrison's heart monitor began to show irregular rhythms. The PR interval was shortening. The QRS complex was widening. The rhythm was deteriorating toward ventricular fibrillation. Within 2 minutes, it arrived, the flat line that announced cardiac arrest, the moment when the body's electrical system shut itself down rather than continue in a state of insufficient oxygenation and profound metabolic failure. Alarm screamed. The overhead intercom crackled, code blue, room 347. Code blue, room 347. Margaret was already moving. The monitor flatlined at 5:40 a.m. One long electrical scream. No beep. No rhythm. Just the sound of a heart that had stopped. Margaret was already moving. Room 347. Derek Morrison's chest heaving once, twice, then nothing. The full line trembled as his body went rigid. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pushing air into lungs that couldn't process oxygen anymore. His post-operative infection had escalated past sepsis, past the boundaries of what antibiotics could fix. The fluid had accumulated inside his pericardium, the sac around his heart, compressing the organ with every heartbeat until there was no heartbeat left. CPR wouldn't work. Chest compressions on a heart already drowning in its own fluid. Margaret knew this the way she knew how to breathe. Muscle memory. Combat medicine. 20 years ago in Helmand Province, she'd learned that sometimes the textbook answer meant watching someone die while you followed protocol. She moved toward the crash cart. The code team was 97 seconds out. She knew because she'd heard the overhead page at 5:39. Code blue, room 347. She counted seconds like ammunition. Every one mattered. Every one Morrison didn't have. The scalpel was right where it always was on the crash cart tray. Not sterile. Not the right instrument. Perfectly adequate for what she needed. She didn't announce herself. Didn't call for assistance. Her hands moved the way they'd moved at the FST, Forward Surgical Team, when the alternative to an authorized intervention was explaining to a mother why she'd followed regulations instead of saving her son. Hands steady as surgical lasers. Voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and purposeful, call blood bank. ONEG, 6 units. Now. A resident froze. Margaret was already cutting. The thoracotomy incision went between the 4th and 5th ribs, left anterior axillary line. For inches of tissue separation. The scalpel parted skin like a command, clean, decisive, the kind of cut that left no room for hesitation. She was through the subcutaneous fat in 3 seconds. Through the intercostal muscles in 2 more. The pleura gave with a sound like a membrane rupturing, a wet whisper of air escaping. The smell hit her, blood and antiseptic mixing with something darker, the copper stench of infection. His left lung collapsed inward. His heart lay exposed, pale and barely moving, surrounded by bloody fluid. Margaret's right hand entered his chest cavity. Her gloved fingers found the pericardium, the membrane surrounding the heart like a constricting fist. She incised it with the same scalpel, opening the sac. Blood poured out. 140 milliliters of infected fluid draining away from the organ that had stopped beating. She positioned her palm against the left ventricle. 1 compression. Hard, deliberate, the force of someone who'd performed this procedure in a tent with mortar fire hammering the sandbags outside. The heart moved under her hand. Shifted. Resisted. 2 compressions. Slower. Methodical. Not panicked. Never panicked. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint, the physical manifestation of standing at the edge of a decision and choosing the correct action instead of the legal one. 3 compressions. Morrison's heart responded with a faint flutter. Just electrical activity. No rhythm yet. Just the beginning of coming back. For compressions. Sinus rhythm. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. A steady cadence emerged from the flat line like a voice calling back from underneath water. The heart was beating again. Not perfectly. Not strong. But beating. 82 beats per minute. His O2 saturation climbed 68%. 74%. 81%. The code team burst through the door at 17 seconds past the initial compression. Dr. Chen, the attending cardiologist, froze. His mouth opened. Closed. His eyes moved from Morrison's exposed heart to Margaret's blood-covered hand to her steady face. What the hell did you do? Dr. Caldwell was 3 steps behind him. Margaret stepped back from the table, her right hand still inside Morrison's chest. Blood dripped from her elbow onto the sterile field. She'd performed cardiac surgery. Unauthorized cardiac surgery. Everything about it was a violation. Everything about it had saved his life. She met Caldwell's gaze. Her voice dropped an octave. The mask slipped for 1 visible second, the exhausted nurse disappeared, replaced by someone whose composure came from having already survived the worst. Emergency thoracotomy. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardial fluid was compressing his heart. Direct compression restored sinus rhythm. He's stable. Morrison's heart beat strong now. The monitor showed a perfect rhythm. His O2 saturation read 89% and climbing. Caldwell's face went white. Not with relief. Not with gratitude. Calculation. Pure, cold calculation. His eyes moved from Morrison to Margaret to the evidence of her unauthorized procedure. She could see the moment he understood that she'd just prevented his investigation from being closed out by a patient death. She'd just saved his biggest liability. You performed an authorized surgery. His voice was quiet. Controlled. Dangerous. You violated every protocol in this hospital. Get out. Now. I want you off this property in 20 minutes or I'm calling security. Chen stepped forward. Martin, she's done here. Caldwell turned to the charge nurse. Get someone to close his chest. Standard subcutaneous closure. And find me everyone who witnessed this. I want statements. He pointed at Margaret without looking at her. 20 minutes. Margaret pulled off her gloves. Tossed them into the biohazard container. She looked at Morrison's face, color returning, breathing easier, alive. She'd done what she came to do. She'd answered the call that had brought her to this hospital in the first place. She'd just destroyed her operational cover in the process. Within 2 hours, Caldwell activated his network like he was detonating a predetermined sequence. Board member Harrison took his call at 6:17 a.m. while still in his robe, listening to Caldwell describe a liability situation in clinical, measured language that somehow made an authorized surgery sound like a threat to the hospital's accreditation. Harrison had benefited from $17,000 in fraudulent consulting fees that Caldwell had routed through a medical equipment vendor. One phone call from Harrison put 3 other board members on alert. By 6:45 a.m., Caldwell was making calls to Margaret's listed references, her former supervisor at Providence Hospital, a colleague from her brief stint at Harborview Medical Center. He asked careful questions designed to unearth inconsistencies. How would you characterize her judgment under pressure? Did she ever mention military experience? Would you be surprised to learn she performed unauthorized procedures? The questions had hooks built into them. If the answers contradicted his version of events, he could claim her references had lied. At 7:15 a.m., he met with Linda Reeves, an outside medical review investigator he'd worked with on 3 previous cases. All 3 had resulted in favorable documentation for Caldwell. All 3 had included cash payments labeled as expert consultation fees. He offered her $3,200 to conduct an expedited review of Margaret's credentials and her performance in room 347. He didn't need a legitimate investigation. He needed documentation that looked legitimate. By noon, Margaret was sitting in an HR office on the 3rd floor with a folder marked termination sitting on the desk between her and an HR specialist who'd never made eye contact. The letter cited gross negligence, unauthorized medical procedures, dangerous deviation from established protocol, and a potential threat to patient safety. It recommended immediate termination with no severance. It suggested that Margaret's credentials warranted deeper investigation, but not by Seattle General. The hospital was protecting itself by firing her first. Margaret could have fought it. Could have demanded a hearing. Could have called a union representative. Could have revealed that her nursing license was legitimate, that her credentials would withstand scrutiny, that every procedure she'd performed was authorized by the emergency circumstances that permitted deviation from standard protocol. But any investigation deeper than Caldwell's surface-level document review would expose the truth about her identity. 20 months of infiltration. 1 week away from completing the evidence chain that connected the contaminated surgical equipment to 4 Marine deaths. 1 week from walking out of this hospital with documentation that would end Caldwell's career and his supply chain conspiracy. Instead, she accepted the termination in silence. She signed the paperwork. She collected her personal items from her locker. She walked out of Seattle General carrying a cardboard box. The basement laundry facility was empty at 11:11 p.m. Institutional washers hummed their rhythmic cycle. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead like a dying heartbeat. Margaret folded her scrubs with the same precision she gave to everything, each crease deliberate, each fold positioned with the discipline of someone who'd been trained to execute movements flawlessly under pressure. The scrubs had been her cover. The work had been her mission. The hospital had been her operating theater. She smoothed the creases one final time and set the folded items on the counter beside her locker box. She looked at her hands. Blood still under her fingernails despite 2 washings. She'd saved Morrison's life. She'd given him 5, 10, maybe 50 more years. He would recover. He would go home. He would live because she'd broken every regulation in existence to keep him breathing. The price was everything else. She picked up the cardboard box containing her concealed documentation phone, the one connected directly to a Pentagon liaison. Her combat boots. A photograph of Morrison as an infant, taken by a colleague in Helmand Province, Margaret in the background shielding him from the camera like she was shielding him from the world. Mission failed. She was halfway across the parking lot when a teenage boy ran directly into her path, clutching something against his chest like it was sacred. "Mom, they need to see these." Aaron, 16, out of breath, eyes wide. He was holding her dress uniform. The white one. The service dress with ribbons arranged in prescribed order. He was holding her medal case. I called Uncle James. He said bring these. Now. Margaret's hands tightened on the cardboard box. Aaron, go home. Mom, you don't understand. He said. She couldn't stop him. He was already running back toward the hospital entrance, her uniform like a flag in his hands. While Margaret stood in the lobby holding her box of locker contents, her son Aaron sprinting toward her with her dress uniform draped across his arms, Dr. Caldwell sat 6 floors above in his private office with the hospital's credential verification system glowing on his monitor, his fingers moving with the frantic precision of a man running out of time. He'd watched the commotion downstairs through his window, the gathering crowd, the uniforms starting to arrive, Morrison standing up in the hospital gown like some kind of monument, and he understood in that moment with absolute clarity that Margaret Walsh was not who she'd claimed to be. Which meant she could destroy him. which meant he had to destroy her first. His password opened the personnel file in 3 seconds. Margaret Ellen Walsh. Nursing License 8 for 72930OR. Verified through the Oregon Health Authority. He pulled the credential verification database, found her social security number, and stared at it like it was a bomb that had been placed on his desk. One alteration. A single digit changed and the whole thing becomes suspicious. Unverifiable. Fraudulent. He began typing. The cursor blinked. 8 for 7293, he changed the last digit. 8 for 7294, wrong social security number on file. Disqualification. Immediate investigation into credential fraud. He created a backdated disciplinary warning dated September 14. Employee verbally warned regarding medication administration error, potential patient safety concern. Another one dated October 2. Another one dated October 18. 3 strikes. Pattern of negligence. He forwarded all 3 to the board investigator, to hospital legal counsel, to the 3 board members he'd cultivated like garden plants over the past 8 years, each message crafted with careful concern. I hate to bring this up, but I have an ethical obligation. Our former employee may have misrepresented her credentials. He was composing the 4th email when the first alert triggered at the FBI field office in Portland, Oregon, Section Chief Torres receiving an automated flag from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, attempted alteration of credentials belonging to an active military operative under federal operational status. The system had been designed for exactly this scenario. The moment anyone tried to forge records of someone cleared at the highest security levels, bells started ringing in 4 separate government agencies simultaneously. Margaret was walking across the parking lot when Torres received the call from NCIS. She was opening her car door when Agents Kim and Rodriguez were already running the background on Dr. Martin Caldwell. She was driving away from Seattle General when the surveillance footage from the hospital's internal network was being pulled and examined, showing Caldwell's access logs, his alterations, his emails, all of it time-stamped, all of it documented, all of it perfectly incriminating. The arrest happened 42 minutes after Margaret pulled out of the parking lot. Dr. Caldwell didn't hear them come through his office door. Agent Kim produced a badge. Dr. Martin Caldwell. And there it was, the moment where the world inverted. The moment where the man who'd spent 20 years building power discovered that power was an illusion built on the assumption that nobody would look closely. Nobody would check. Nobody cared enough to verify. But somebody had cared. Somebody had been paying such meticulous attention that every single thing he'd done was now illuminated like a crime scene under ultraviolet light. This is absurd, Caldwell said, and his voice sounded wrong to him, too high, too thin. I'm a physician. There's been a mistake. Agent Kim's expression didn't change. You altered federal records. You attempted to plant evidence of credential fraud against a Master Chief Petty Officer conducting a lawful investigation into your supply chain conspiracy. She turned the tablet toward him. Access logs. His login information. His alterations timestamped at 4:23 p.m., 4:02 p.m., 5:12 p.m. The emails he'd sent, still sitting in the outbox, each one a perfect record of his intent. You have communications with board member Harrison discussing payment structures for equipment purchases. You have the distributor contracts showing inflated costs. You have the shipment manifests for contaminated surgical equipment authorized for purchase. The room wasn't moving, but it felt like it was tilting. Caldwell's hands gripped the edge of his desk. I want my attorney. That's your right, Torres said, and she sounded almost kind. Almost sorry. Almost like she'd seen this before, the moment a man realized he'd played a game where all the other players had been wearing body cameras. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. The handcuffs went on with a click that echoed through the office like a period at the end of a sentence. One of the hospital security cameras caught it, the moment Kim turned him toward the door, his face gray, his tie loose. Another camera caught him in the hallway, passing a staff member who stopped walking, who stared. A third caught him at the elevator doors opening onto the lobby where a local news crew was setting up equipment for a hospital charity event they'd been covering, and when they saw a man in handcuffs being escorted out by federal agents, they turned their cameras. They always turn their cameras. The perp walk. That's what it's called. That's what the footage would be labeled in court records and news archives. Dr. Caldwell, medical director, Seattle General, being led out to a federal vehicle in his white coat and dark trousers, his face turned away, his attorney barking that everyone remain silent, a junior resident standing in the lobby with her hand over her mouth, 3 nurses pretending not to watch, hospital security trying to maintain order. The news anchor would later describe it as stunning, that word carrying the weight of something nobody had expected, something that had arrived like a lightning strike into clear sky. 6 hours earlier, Margaret had been folding scrubs in the basement. Now she stood in the lobby watching the footage happen in real time, her box still in her arms, her son beside her son who'd had the presence of mind to run home and retrieve her dress uniform when she called him from her car with words that had taken her 9 years to say, "I need to show you something." And Captain Morrison, still in his hospital gown, still bandaged, still healing, stood at attention in front of General Patricia Winters, who'd arrived by Black Hawk from Bremerton Naval Base the moment the NCIS alert went out, who'd taken one look at Margaret's face and understood that something much larger than a doctor's misconduct had just surfaced. The interrogation room footage wouldn't be publicly available, but it existed in federal records. Caldwell, hollow-eyed, sitting across from federal prosecutors who laid out the case like a deck of cards, each one falling with the weight of irrefutable evidence. For Marines dead from surgical site infections caused by contaminated implants. $1.2 million in fraudulent billing. $340,000 in kickbacks paid to offshore accounts. Board member Harrison had already flipped, already agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced charge. The unlicensed distributor had been raided. Financial records showed everything. His medical license was suspended 48 hours later. Criminal charges came 72 hours after that: conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, involuntary manslaughter on 4 counts, falsification of federal records, obstruction of justice, making false statements to federal investigators. 30 years. Restitution payments to the families of deceased Marines. The sum kept growing as the investigation expanded, each layer peeling back to reveal another layer, like an onion made of paper-thin corruption. 6 months later, Margaret Walsh walked into the Seattle General Auditorium in her Master Chief dress uniform, the ribbons on her chest catching the stage lights like small flames. Hospital Administrator Brennan stood at the podium, and the room, 200 staff members, nurses and doctors and custodial workers and billing specialists, fell silent in a way that felt different than 6 months ago. Different because now they knew. Now they understood that the tired woman who'd worked night shifts in discount scrubs had been someone else entirely. Someone whose hands had saved Captain Derek Morrison's life while her official body was being terminated in the administrative office upstairs. Someone whose real mission had been to expose the exact conspiracy that had now resulted in federal charges against the man who'd thrown a patient chart at her feet and smiled. Dr. Patel read the citation. The Navy recognized her thoracotomy that had saved Morrison's life. The hospital recognized her investigation that had led to the arrest of Dr. Caldwell and 3 co-conspirators. The federal government recognized her testimony in the case against the supply chain conspiracy that had poisoned 17 Marines across 3 military hospitals. The Civilian Valor Award, presented to civilians whose actions demonstrated extraordinary courage in defense of life. The applause was a sound like rainfall hitting the auditorium roof, like something genuine and unstoppable. Morrison stood in dress blues in the front row, his shoulder healed, his scar invisible under the uniform, and when Margaret stepped down from the stage, he saluted her the way you salute someone who outranks you in ways that go beyond insignia. But that wasn't the end of the reckoning. The community college appeared smaller in daylight, its buildings arranged around a common green that smelled like cut grass and autumn. Margaret walked through the education building in her dress uniform. She decided to come directly after accepting a speaking engagement there about combat trauma and medical response, and when she entered the gymnasium where CPR certification classes were held, she found Dr. Martin Caldwell arranging plastic training dummies on a floor, arranging them in orderly rows, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone doing something they'd done 1,000 times and would do 1,000 more times because this was the only work available to him anymore. $16.50 per hour. Pre-sentencing work release agreement. Community college, minimum wage, teaching people how to save lives while he waited for his trial. His head came up. Their eyes met across the gymnasium like 2 points of light finding each other through the dark. Margaret didn't smile. Margaret didn't say anything. Margaret just walked past him toward the main auditorium where the Naval League's Regional Teaching Excellence Award ceremony was about to begin, and Caldwell watched her go, watched the way her uniform seemed to fill the space around her, watched the Navy Cross gleam on her chest, watched the evidence of everything he'd done walking away from him in the shape of a woman he'd tried to erase and couldn't. The award ceremony proceeded in the main hall. 200 people. Speeches about mentoring. Margaret's name called for her work training combat medics, for her innovations in trauma response protocols, for the lives she'd saved both in theater and in civilian hospitals. The applause was the same sound as before, rainfall, genuine, unstoppable. She didn't mention Dr. Caldwell. She didn't need to. He was already a footnote in her story, a character in someone else's narrative of failure. She'd moved on to the work of saving people. That night, Margaret stood in her home office looking at the shadow box mounted on the wall. The Navy Cross centered in polished display case, earned 20 years ago in Helmand Province when she'd thrown her body over an 8-month-old infant Marine named Derek Morrison and held him safe while mortar rounds turned the world into thunder and blood and dust. Below the medal, on a custom shelf, lay a pair of tiny combat boots, the one she'd pulled from the rubble that day, the one she'd carried with her through 20 years of separate identities, separate missions, separate lives. Next to the infant boot stood a photograph of Morrison as he was now, Captain Derek Morrison in his dress blues, pinning his own Bronze Star 3 weeks ago, his shoulders back, his eyes clear, a man who'd nearly died on a night shift in Portland and lived because someone had been paying attention. Her phone rang. NCIS, secure line. Another hospital. San Diego Naval Medical. Same pattern, inflated equipment costs, contaminated surgical supplies, someone profiting while service members suffered. They needed her. A new cover. A new identity. 6 months minimum, probably longer. Aaron appeared in the doorway. How long this time? Don't know yet, Margaret said, and she was already packing the go bag that lived in the closet, the one that had lived in closets across the country for the last 2 decades. Clean scrubs. Documentation. The carefully constructed layers of whoever she was going to become next. Will you come back? Margaret picked up the shadow box, looked at the tiny boots one more time. Always. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. She walked out into the night, the door closing behind her like a period at the end of a sentence, like the conclusion of one chapter and the beginning of another, like the only life she'd ever really known. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. These stories need to be told. Like this video if you believe in the hidden heroes working in plain sight. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? What would you have done in Margaret's position?